What does a covenant look like? What covenants has God actually made with mankind, and what do they look like? And I assure you, covenants do follow a pattern. You can't see every element of this pattern in every covenant described in Scripture, but you can see the general outline. Some of these covenants show all of the points of this pattern. Some only show a few of them. But we know from the discussion of covenants in the books of Galatians and Hebrews that God's covenants follow a consistent pattern. So let's take a look at what that pattern looks like in Scripture. The covenants that God made with Abraham and with the Israelites in the wilderness follow the same basic patterns that were used by other ancient peoples at that same time. All elements of every covenant are not included in the biblical narrative, as I mentioned earlier. There are different kinds of covenants. There are covenants between peers, covenants between a ruler and his subjects, what might be called a suzerain vassal treaty. There are covenants that grant land in exchange for service. God often follows man's expectations for procedures, and that includes what he does in covenants. But I think it's much more likely, since God established a covenant in the very beginning with Adam, that mankind is following God's pattern and not the other way around. And the ancient peoples at the time of Abraham and the Israelites in the wilderness were more likely to understand God's pattern than we are today. Today, in many what you might call primitive cultures around the world, you can still see elements of these covenants in action. For example, when somebody cuts their hand and they shake hands to mingle their blood together. This is sort of a shadow of the way that covenants used to work. And it's much more likely that people have just forgotten the way that covenants were supposed to work in the beginning and forgot what the point of the blood was. God certainly can use what people are used to and communicate with them through that. And he does, as we see when God speaks to mankind through their own languages, through their customs. But I don't think that's what's happening with the patterns and the elements in a covenant. The basic elements of a covenant seem to be supported by the biblical text in aggregate. Most covenants described in the Bible don't list all of these elements. A few of them do, but throughout the text of Scripture we see all of these elements that are present in to one extent or another. So when you look at all of them from the beginning to end, you can see a basic pattern. The letters to the Galatians and the Hebrews show that the biblical authors were aware of this pattern, and that the pattern is something that God designed from the beginning. So that rather than God following man's expectations are probably based in God's original design. The first element of a covenant is the relationship. You can't make a covenant with somebody you don't have a relationship with, but a covenant formalizes that relationship. Abraham was a friend of God before he had a covenant with God. But when God made that covenant, Abraham became a prophet and an ambassador on earth on his behalf. The second element is agreement. There must be a desire on part of both sides to formalize this relationship. God is very unlikely to make a covenant with anyone who doesn't want anything to do with him. God made a covenant with the Israelites, not with Pharaoh. He made a covenant with Abraham, not with Abimelech. The next element are witnesses. Every covenant should have witnesses for accountability and for later testimony. Covenants also have a record. For most legal covenants, there would be at least 2 copies, sometimes 3. Each person would get a copy, and there would be a copy filed with a third party, sort of like the county courthouse. So if there is any disagreement, they can compare the copies, or they can go back to the original one that's filed at the courthouse and validate that nobody has changed the copies that are in each person's hands. Fifth, a covenant has a sign. This is an ongoing reminder that there is a covenant so that nobody forgets. This could be something that people do, something they wear, or it could be a pile of stones or an altar, a building. For example, if 2 neighbors negotiate a property line, they might put up a fence post or a pillar on that property line so that everybody knows there was a covenant made. We have an agreement between these 2 parties. The next element is blood. A covenant is sealed with blood. Now today we often talk about a covenant church or a covenant community. But homeowners' agreements and church membership really aren't covenants because they aren't sealed with blood. Hebrews 9:16-17 says, "For where a will is involved, the death of the one who made it must be established. For a will takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive." I know this might sound prideful, but that is a terrible translation. The Greek word here for will is the same word translated elsewhere as covenant. This isn't talking about a last will. This is talking about a covenant. This is from Young's literal translation. "For where a covenant is, the death of the covenant victim to come in is necessary. For a covenant over dead victims is steadfast, since it is no force at all when the covenant victim liveth." Young's literal translation is so literal that it's awkward. But most English translations of these verses talk about a last will, which is really strange because that's not how that word is used throughout the rest of the New Testament. Everywhere else, it's translated as a covenant. And this makes perfect sense in this context. It's not the signer of a last will that is being killed. It's a sacrificial victim that is killed to seal a covenant. In almost every covenant described in Scripture, there is a sacrifice or a death of an animal that goes along with it. And this symbolizes the blood of the one making the covenant. It shows just how powerful the idea of a covenant is. This animal is dying to seal this agreement between us. And if we violate this, it's like we're killing a part of ourselves. As I mentioned before, pagan covenants often involve the mingling of the blood of the parties. But that's really not the same thing. It kind of shows the same idea of the seriousness of a covenant and the threat of death for violating it. But it really doesn't seal the covenant the same way that the actual death of an animal does. The next element is inheritance. Covenants, as I mentioned, are sealed with blood, and this symbolizes the blood of the parties. And so through that blood, the covenant is inherited by their blood descendants. Now, it's not actually the blood of the people making the covenant, but the blood of the animal, but it is symbolic of their own blood. And this is why the pagan practices of mingling the blood of the covenant parties actually has some basis in God's original plan. And the final element are blessings and cursings. These are the benefits of honoring the relationship that is established by the covenant, or the costs of abusing that relationship. And we can see these promises of blessings or promises of curses in the last part of the book of Deuteronomy. And remember, as I noted before, that not all of these elements will be present in the text in the scripture for every covenant. The biblical authors assumed that their audience understood how covenants work, and so they didn't always say, this party did this element and this element and this element and check off all the boxes. They just say, these people made a covenant, and then they had this festive meal. Well, the meal is eating the sacrificial victim, and all the rest is assumed. Giving every detail of every covenant would be a distraction and not really part of the purpose of most of Scripture. So let's take a look at 3 specific covenants and look at how some of these elements come out of the text. The first covenant is the Noahic covenant, sometimes called the Noahide covenant. This is detailed in Genesis 6:18 and 8:20 through 9:17. Noah offered a sacrifice. God defined a relationship between himself and Noah, mankind, and all life, and God appointed a rainbow to be a sign of this covenant. If you look at the text in Genesis, all 8 elements of a covenant are present. I recommend you go back and read this passage. It's a little bit too long for me to read and fit it into this presentation. The next one I want to look at is the covenant between Jacob and Laban in Genesis chapter 31. This covenant was made to formalize terms of peace between them. Jacob agreed to be a faithful husband to Laban's daughters, and Laban agreed to stay on his side of the boundary and not mess with Jacob. To mark this covenant, they erected a stone pillar as a boundary that neither one of them would cross, and then they sealed it with a sacrifice and a feast. The third covenant is the covenant at Gilgal, and this is from Joshua chapter 9. While Joshua and the Israelites were conquering Canaan, many of the people were afraid. The Gibeonites pretended to be from a people from far away, and they made a covenant with Israel under false pretenses. They established a relationship, everybody agreed to it, they sacrificed animals and shared a meal, and then there are curses and blessings. The curse on the Gibeonites was to be perpetual servants. The promise was to be protected. And when the lie was discovered, that curse came into action, and the Gibeonites were condemned to be perpetual servants to the people of Israel. But even then, Joshua and David upheld this covenant later and defended the people of Gibeon. The Bible is actually full of covenants. There are more than 34 of them that I could count. There are covenants between God and people, God and nations, between one people and another people, between individuals. Even marriage is kind of a covenant, although it's a different one and doesn't really have all of these 8 elements all of the time. I put together this list of all the covenants I could find in Scripture. Feel free to take a screenshot of this because it might be a little overwhelming to look at in this presentation. There are 7 things that I want you to learn from this chart. First, not every covenant is explicitly labeled as a covenant in Scripture. For example, the first Adamic covenant isn't called a covenant in Genesis. It's only much later in the book of Hosea that God says Adam broke a covenant. So there could be many more covenants between God and people or between the various people in the Bible that just aren't recorded in the Bible. The second thing is that God has many covenants, not just 2. He doesn't have just the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. If you look at the right-hand column, it shows the parties to the covenants. The first 4 covenants on the screen were between God and people. The first 3 covenants were between God and all mankind. Only in that 4th covenant does it begin to be narrowed down. The third thing to learn is that God makes covenants with whomever he chooses. You might have heard that God only makes covenants with Israel, but that's not true. God made a covenant with Adam and Eve. God made a covenant with all of the animals on earth. And this is clearly recorded in Scripture. However, it is true that God focuses on Israel. And this is the 4th thing. God initiated at least 5 covenants with Israel and at least 3 with subsets of Israel. The first of these covenants is in Genesis 15 and 17 and Leviticus 26, and this is the covenant between God and Abraham and all of Abraham's descendants, or at least Abraham's descendants through Isaac and Jacob. Later, God made a covenant with Aaron and his descendants, and then with Pinchas and his descendants, and then with David and his descendants. 5th, Israelite rulers initiated at least another 5 covenants with God. Presumably, God honored these covenants, but he didn't initiate them. 6th, covenants were common between people throughout most of history. Today, most people don't even know what a covenant is. They think it's just a contract, but a covenant is much more serious than a contract. But the ancient peoples understood this. Kings frequently made covenants with each other. Neighbors made covenants with each other. 2 traders might even make a covenant when they were agreeing what to trade, and then they would kill an animal and have a feast, both to seal the covenant and to celebrate their new trade agreement. The 7th thing to learn is that no covenant of God ever nullifies, cancels, or replaces an older covenant. That last point is critical to remember. Look at the highlights on the screen. All of the yellow highlights are covenants that God initiated with the people of Israel. Not a single one of them nullifies a previous one. The covenant that God made with Israel in the land of Moab didn't violate or nullify or override the covenant of the Sabbath that God made at Sinai, or the covenant that God made from the mountain of Sinai with the Ten Commandments, or the covenant that God made with Abraham before that. All of these covenants are cumulative, not exclusive. Now let's take a closer look at the 5 covenants that God made with the whole people of Israel. The first covenant is the Abrahamic covenant. This is in Genesis 15 and 17. God unilaterally promised to make Abraham the father of many nations, to give the land of Canaan to one of those nations, and to bless all the nations of the world through his seed. The next covenant is Sinai. In this covenant, described in Exodus 19 to 24 and chapter 34, Yahweh would be the God of the Hebrews if they would be his people. They agreed, and he promised to protect them and provide for them in the land of the Canaanites if they obeyed his law. This covenant explicitly includes both the native and the adopted people who came out of Egypt with Israel. The people agreed to these terms, and the covenant was made. They didn't keep it, but that doesn't invalidate the covenant. All it does is invoke the curses of the covenant. The third covenant is the Sabbath covenant, where God set the Sabbath day apart from all other commandments as a covenant in itself, with death as the penalty for violation. I do recognize that the existence of this covenant is debatable. But the language of Exodus 31, verse 16, seems pretty clear to me. Therefore the people of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath throughout their generations as a covenant forever. The fourth covenant is the Deuteronomic covenant. This is sometimes called the Palestinian covenant, but with the modern political situation, that can sometimes be confusing and misleading. And once again, the Deuteronomic covenant is made explicitly with the native-born Israelites and all those grafted in from the nations. It's described in Deuteronomy 29 to 30. God promised again to give the land of the Canaanites to Israel and to protect and provide for them in the land as long as they kept his law, with defeat and exile as the penalty for violation. He also promised to restore them, to circumcise their hearts, and to make them prosperous when they repented. And we know that this is a separate covenant because Deuteronomy 29 verse 1 says, "These are the words of the covenant that Yahweh commanded Moses to make with the people of Israel in the land of Moab, besides the covenant that he made with them at Horeb." And it didn't cancel out the covenant that God made with them at Horeb, which is another word for Sinai. The fifth covenant is the one that most Christians are more familiar with. It's the New Covenant. It was promised in Jeremiah 31 through 33, talked about throughout Isaiah, chapter 42, 49, 55, etc., and talked about more in Ezekiel 34, verses 25 to 31. In the New Covenant, God promised not only to restore all of Israel to prosperity in the land, but to completely remove their sins, give them authority over the whole world, and to live among them forever. One important thing to note about this covenant is that Jeremiah 31 says, God made this covenant only with the houses of Israel and Judah. But following the pattern of earlier covenants, this includes all of the people who are grafted in from the nations. They are made part of Israel and Judah by God's decree and therefore part of this covenant. Next, I want to take a brief look at 3 more covenants that God made with a subset of Israel. The first covenant is the Aaronic covenant for a perpetual priesthood. God made Aaron and his sons to be priests to maintain his altar and tabernacle and to be part of the high court and the primary teachers of Israel in exchange for a portion of the tithes and offerings of the people. This is described in Numbers 18 and Leviticus 8 through 9. And God said that as long as Aaron had descendants, this covenant would stand. The second covenant is the Pinchasic covenant, and this is made with somebody you might know as Phinehas. He's the grandson of Aaron, so he's one of the sons of Aaron, so he's part of that first covenant with Aaron also. Because of Pinchas's zeal in protecting God's holiness and the people from idolatry, God promised that his descendants would always serve him as priests, even though other priestly families might be cut off. And this is described in Numbers 25, verses 10 to 13. What this means is that individual sons of Aaron, or branches of Aaron's descendants, could be cut off from the covenant with Aaron, but at least through the family of Pinchas, God would keep that covenant with Aaron. Through him, God would maintain a remnant of priests who are faithful to him, who would always be eligible to serve him. The third covenant is the Davidic covenant, and most Christians have heard of this one also. This covenant is described briefly in 2 Samuel 23, 1-7, 2 Chronicles 21, 7, and Psalm 89, 3 and 4. In the Davidic covenant, God anointed David as a man after his own heart to be the king of Israel, and promised that he would always have a descendant to sit on the throne. And one of the fulfillments of the Davidic covenant is that Yeshua came through the line of David and is now king of both heaven and earth. And he will return from heaven to sit on a physical throne in Jerusalem to rule over the people of Israel. There are many other covenants that God made with people, with individual people, or with groups of people. There are at least 5 other subsets of Israel that made independence with God that were mediated by kings, priests, or governors of Judah. And it's very likely that God made any number of covenants that are not recorded in Scripture. God has a covenant relationship with every single person and every animal on earth. And this was inherited from the covenants he made with Adam and Noah. God's covenants have followed a consistent pattern from the very beginning. Over time, man has corrupted that pattern, so that what we see today are twisted, half-forgotten versions of the pattern that was followed by the patriarchs. Everyone on earth is involved in multiple covenants simultaneously. And these covenants are cumulative. They don't replace each other. So God made at least 8 covenants with Israel, 5 with the whole people of Israel, 3 with parts of Israel. And all of these covenants work together to define the relationship between Israel and God. In part 3, we'll cover more details of covenants, how they work, how are they initiated, how can a covenant end, and what does being in a covenant mean for you and me?